So, oh, phew, I said that before we were live streamed. Good morning. We'll probably wait a few minutes to get started. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We're letting people into the room now. Mark, were you're able to go first for the presentation, and then
I have until 1 o'clock, so whatever you would like, Senator.
okay, I'll have you go first, and then is Scott going to speak as well?
Scott Gall is expecting to attend from OPM. And,
okay.
I do see we also have Josiah from Vermont, who's on the call too.
So we'll probably have it go you, Scott, Josiah, and then I think Professor Suresh. Hey, Tim, can you mute yourself? Okay, thank you. All right, MJ, how many people are in the waiting room?
We just have 2 left.
Okay, let's let them in, and then Mark, do you need to be able to present anything, or do you need to be made a co-host?
I do not,
Okay.
but I do expect that Scott Gall does have some slides. So just for your expectations, I don't.
Okay. Hey, MJ, if you wouldn't mind, before we get started, then if you could make allow Scott, Josiah, and Professor Suresh to share their screens so that when they're up, they can share any.
Yeah, I'll allow people to share their screen. Cool.
Okay.
I just joined while Mark was talking, and if it helps for me to send slides to anybody, I can do that. I'm not 100% sure if I don't need them or not. This is Scott.
Okay. If you could, send them so that we can share them out afterwards, that would be great. And then we'll just have we'll allow you to control your screen. So you can
it was already on all participants, so we're good.
Okay. And then Kier, would you mind muting yourself? Thank you. Okay, and MJ, are we all set?
Everyone is out of the waiting room, yes.
Okay, great. All right. It's afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending the Data Privacy Task Force. Today we're going to be going over the proposal regarding the AI and this state use of automated systems for critical decisions. We sent around the draft language over the weekend. I do apologize for the quick turnaround. There is time, we'll continue to work on this language as we go through the session. So we do have the JF, and for those who aren't familiar with Connecticut lingo, to vote the bill out of the committee. The plan is to do that this Thursday, and then to continue working on it until and if it gets called in the Senate, it'll go to the Senate first and then to the House. So if you have suggestions even after this meeting, please feel free to reach out, as we do intend to continue working on this because we know it is important. With that being said, we have 4 people who are going to present. I'm very excited. We're going to start with Mark Raymond, who is Connecticut's CIO. He is in the office of DAS. And so we're going to start with Mark. Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Senator Maroney. And it's fabulous to be with all of you today to talk about, a really important topic. I love the fact that, our legislature is getting more and more engaged in technology. It is one of the fundamental levers that we have to transform government and make it provide better outcomes. Because we do have some folks who are on the call who may not be familiar with some of the functions, I think just a very quick overview might be helpful in the context of the overall bill. Scott Goff from OPM will talk in a little bit, but by way of context, OPM is responsible for technology policy in our state's data plan. And so my organization, DAS, is responsible for technology procurement and then also implementation of technology. And if you think about sort of applications and data centers, networks, those kinds of things. But really my authority goes to the executive branch only. Doesn't include quasi-governmentals, doesn't include sort of constitutional offices. So really think about the executive branch of government. Doesn't include universities for that matter, like UConn or the Board of Regents. And that in this mix of delivery, our agencies themselves are usually responsible for the testing and measurement of business outcomes, right? So what metrics do they track, and how does technology meet their program and business goals? And so each has a role to play in ensuring equitable and efficient operation of government and the provision of benefits that we have out there. So just setting the table briefly around that. As it relates to the AI bill that's out there, I think, you know, that when we look at artificial intelligence, it provides a great set of both opportunities and threats to the way that we operate. I know that that's part of what you've been considering. So the uniqueness of government, sort of the good news in this conversation, is where state governments are one of the most highly regulated groups that we have. You know, of the data that we do operate on, we have almost every style of federal regulation besides state regulation. So we have FERPA for educational records, HIPAA for medical, CAMPA for computer matching. We have IRS, Social Security, CMS for Medicaid data. And these regulations cover the concepts of human interaction. For example, CMS says you must have human review over Medicaid determinations and redeterminations. Like you have to, you can't just totally automate that. And so there's lots of process in place. We also have institutions that review outcomes of both human and systemic interactions. Folks like EEO and CHRO, you know, our appeals processes, our watchdog organization auditors, they all testing outcomes and processes that are being followed. And so when you think about that regulation and oversight that happens in state government, those are two of the reasons why innovation happens more slowly in state government. Like we have to operate within those complex set of constraints, and those constraints were set to protect the outcomes that I think is the fundamental work behind this bill. They also make things a little bit more expensive and slow to change. So when I think about the decisional AI, you know, these factors drive, you know, how little decisional AI or guided AI that we have in state government today. And while I see the agencies are beginning to experiment with more sort of operational types of artificial intelligence, things like chatbots, automated robotic process automation, identification of anomalous network events that, you know, need to be investigated. We have not gone far to advance the form and the practice of implementing decisional AI that is becoming much more common in private industry. And so I know that there's been some recent media reporting on this, but you know, the fact of the matter is DAS responded to its FOI about algorithms that we indicated that there was no response because we have none. And so I think for the language that we have, I'd urge that Connecticut's approach to this be flexible to account for the rapid changes that are underway. that should be based on the concepts of managing risks and the opportunity of AI. The National Institute of Standards and Technology published the AI Risk Management Framework in January of this year that is both expansive and instructional on this topic. So aligning our efforts in Connecticut with the emerging national approaches will help us remain relevant to the industry and will help us benefit from the learnings of others and will place us in a way to help others who are down this path as well. And happy that we'll get some learnings from the Vermont team who started this journey a little bit ahead of Connecticut. For specific focus, I think we should have it on the technologies. We should pay special attention to the technologies that learn environment and that learn from data and change on an ongoing basis, and either recommend that or replace human decision making. If we focus the legislation on those areas and not broadly on automated systems, that's going to be a better balance of our limited resources. As you can imagine, it would take a rather large investment of people and to assess on an ongoing basis what would be some of the more trivial forms of AI. And examples, the type ahead in your email or, direction, the apps that provide directions, or even something as simple as a building thermostat that's making decisions based on inputs. It would be an immense personal undertaking if we're not focused on just those that have the potential of creating the highest risk and impact. And that's also not to say that human decisions don't create biased outcomes. And in our history, I think we've seen entire systems of human decisions that perpetuate bias that we should also be paying attention to. So for me, fundamentally, an AI platform is based on the data in which it's trained. The more bias in the data that we collect, the more our decisions, both human and machine, will reflect that underlying data. For the bill, I would hope that the efforts could be allocated to looking at this topic on the basis of risk and the state's risk tolerance. First, by tracking where that technology may be in place today, and then reporting on how that technology either improves or perhaps endangers, the outcomes that we are looking at. Finally, I would just share, we do annually provide or publish a technology strategy for the state, which talks about our centralized activities and then the activities of each one of our different agencies. And so I would expect that artificial intelligence will have continue to emerge and have a prominent role in the next iterations of those reports. And they're developed by DAS and propagated by OPM in the fall. So I appreciate your time on this topic and hope this is helpful in your endeavor, and look forward to continuing to work with you on all things related to this matter.
Great. Thanks, Mark. Are you able to take any questions or?
Of course.
Okay, so I'll just open it up and see if any of the participants have questions. If you would just use the raise hand function. And that is, so this is recorded. And so I can go back and review, which is good. So I did take notes. If you heard me, I forgot to mute myself. So if you heard me typing, I was taking notes. So I guess the good thing to understand is if we're looking at developing policy, that's OPM, but implementation is DAS. So if we're looking at ongoing assessment and those reports, whether it's some kind of an impact assessment, that would be done by DAS. And then the inventory, as we have kind of envisioned it, would be something that's done by DAS. Now, I agree on the risk-based framework. I don't know if, my thought was, and we didn't get it in this draft, that instead of just on automated systems, we're looking at automated systems for critical decisions. And then we just need to, as we know, with all legislation, it comes down to definitions, right? So we need to make sure we get the definition of critical. We have a definition of critical decision in there. So that's something, we'll need to look at if that needs to be refined. But in the draft that we'll vote on Thursday, it'll, all of these will be narrowed to the automated decisions or automated systems for critical decisions or for making critical decisions. I'm not sure. The LCO will probably have to chime in on how that should be. I'm trying to think what questions. Okay, so you mentioned the annually published the technology strategy. So is the application inventory part of that? I know you had sent me a sample of the application inventory.
Yes, we do publish that online through the Open Data Portal. And so there is a link in the strategy to where that is published. There's also, I believe, an online or a sort of a PDF version that is also attached to that. But yes, that we do update that link and make sure that it's available to folks on an annual basis.
And so the application inventory is for any applications that are being utilized by the executive agencies?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And so, and I'm just wondering, like, what is efficient, right? We don't want to create whole new systems. Like, how do you work within what's existing? So, I mean, and this is something we'll have to talk through probably offline. So it's probably not necessarily offline, but just meaning I shouldn't be thinking out loud. And maybe I should give a little more thought. But where I was going is I wonder if there's a way within that we would have a checkbox, has an impact assessment been completed, and then linking to that impact assessment if is an impact assessment necessary, was one completed, or again, this is spitballing, so I think it doesn't make sense to do it now, but maybe we can, that's something we can discuss. And then let me see if there are any other hands raised. I don't see any other hands raised right now. So I think what we'll do is thank you very much for that. That's very helpful. And then we'll move on to Scott Gall, who is the Chief Data Officer for the state of Connecticut.
Sorry, double muted. Thank you, Senator Maroney. And I think this will build on what Mark was talking about once I find the thing that I'm looking for. I'm just going to share my screen and go through some slides that go through this in a little more detail. Can I share the? Oh, here we are. Great. Sorry about that. So this, again, appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. And are you seeing the presentation mode of this? Probably not.
We're not seeing presentation mode. We're just seeing your.
Yeah, actually. All right, hold on. Is that better?
I muted myself, but yes, it is better.
Okay, great. All right. This is why we have data and IT experts together. So this, appreciate the opportunity to talk about this complex topic. And I think that's where it's at the intersection of technology and data. And I was just going to go through some of the what we have in place already in the state from what OPM does and how that interacts with the work of DAS. And some of this I think is directly relevant to the topic at hand, and particularly artificial intelligence. And some of it is maybe indirectly relevant, but it's just useful to think about as an example or a parallel set of work that's underway. And I will go through this hopefully fairly quickly. I have a colleague, we have a colleague, Adele Abade, who's the director of IT policy at OPM. He can't be here today, so I'm covering his content as well. So just going to give an overview of the interaction for IT and data between OPM, DAS, and executive branch agencies, and then just a couple examples of things that I know have come up in these discussions, so you can get a sense of how they're either existing or related tools are implemented in state government already. So like Mark had said, and hopefully this is just adding a little more context to this, OPM has sort of the policy development role, and I'll go through this for IT policy, which again is what Adele focuses on, and then for data policy in a second. And again, AI is a good sort of meaty topic to dig into because it really covers the intersection of those two things, technology and data. So for IT policy, OPM is the sort of policymaking agency. We have the statutory references here for folks that want to dig into that in some detail. We make the policy, and then the implementation is kind of as Mark described. And then, as he said, there's an annual IT strategic plan that the hard work of is done through DAS, but it's done in accordance with the policies that OPM sets here. So again, there's this interaction between both agencies for both the development of policy and the regular reporting on it out to the public. For folks that are not, don't necessarily do this day to day, you might be wondering, what are IT policies? What does this mean? So we listed examples of some of these. So if you work at a company or nonprofit, you probably have these for your own organization. So you have acceptable use policy. Can you run a business from your laptop? Should you be watching YouTube videos on your machine? So that's the kind of thing, again, the state sets these things as policies for agencies. We do it the same way, presumably, if you're employed. Your employer does. I listed, there's a handful of examples here. There's a more comprehensive list on the OPM site, but acceptable use, the use of different devices. Data classification looks at how different types of data the state is collecting or classified from a security perspective, how IT projects are managed, how people manage their personal devices, a lot of policies around security, and then things like website accessibility to make sure that the resources we put online can be understood and accessed by all individuals in Connecticut. So these are examples of the kinds of things that are developed as policies in typically like some sort of consultative process where you're reaching out to different stakeholders, getting a sense of what best practices are, what standards are at a national level, what existing standards might be at agencies, pull that together, or Adele really pulls that together, develops the policy, and then it's promulgated and implemented kind of in the way Mark was describing. I'll switch to the data policy, which has more statutory references behind it. But again, just so you have these in one place, I put them in the slide here. Data policies, similar, a little different in some respects. Again, like Mark was saying, it really covers the executive branch. There's several different pieces that interact here. In 2018, the state started out to have a more intentional sort of framework for the executive branch use of data, the same way I think you're looking to do for artificial intelligence here. So we did that by defining terms, creating a role, developing a planning mechanism for that, and putting in place some of the governance tools that agencies use today to track data that's being collected and how it's being used to the public. Sorry, someone's unmuted. Then there's a board that's appointed primarily through the legislature, but has a mix of executive branch staff that provide some oversight functions or advisory functions, I guess, for data. We have a separate set of responsibilities for geospatial information, which is also an area in which I think there's use of both artificial intelligence and the robotic process automation, machine learning, the other terms that I think have come up here because of the volume of information. And then again, within the data policy statutes, there's an interaction with IT to make sure that when we take actions that are related to IT, whether it's acquisition of hardware, software, or something else, that those are consistent with the way in which the state's put forward for planning for the use management collection of data. I will call out, just because I think it's relevant, privacy and ethics. Some of the questions that I think come up, particularly around the use of AI, are called out specifically in the state data plan. Some of this has been in place for a few years now to make sure that these are the principles for how agencies use and manage data in their day-to-day job. And then in this, there's a 2-year planning cycle for data. In the current plan, we have something that's flagged here that I think is inclusive, although not explicit, about making sure that state government develops standards and guidance for the use of new technologies, such as AI. So hopefully, I think what you're seeing is that we have is, I think, consistent with sort of the intention, and there's some of the tools available to address the topics this group has brought up with relative ease. I'm going to cover 2 things just specifically to, again, for the group as a whole, to look at for kind of how we've implemented this. So we inventory 2 different things. Like Mark had said, there's an application inventory of the software, the technology, the applications that agencies are using. We also inventory the data that agencies collect. These are different because the data is often, you could have a system that supports many different data collections, and we have still many different types of data the state collects that are not in a software. So we collect data through Excel. We still have paper records. There's some odd cases where the state is collecting data but doesn't actually store it in an application at the state level. It's kept at the local level or something along those lines. So we inventory separately where the state collects data and the applications it's using. That's the first step in the process that the state undertook for sort of managing data more holistically, is to just take the basic step of figuring out what we have, writing those things down, inventorying them. We use Excel for the data inventory. It's not a overly complicated process. It's just sort of, what is the data that your agency collects? If you're deep, you collect data on these things about the environment, energy protection. If you're OPM, this lists out where we collect data for municipal grants. And so that's the building block. You can't manage things if you don't have sort of the inventory. You can't assess the risk of things if you don't know what they are. So this inventorying activity is something, again, that we're doing already in a couple of different ways. And just to give people sort of a tangible example, and the application inventory, I think, is very similar, just really listing out what those things are, and making this is publicly accessible. The list of all data agencies collect as is the application inventory, so anybody can go check this. And this is similarly updated every year. And then next, one thing that I believe had come up, I pulled the open data portal. You can just see this. So we post data as a state. It is accessed by a lot of people. We're not hiding that, just so you're aware of it. Yesterday was Open Data Day. I hope you all celebrated. And next, so one thing that had come up is the idea of just making this easy for agencies, government to implement. And so in some cases, when there's a policy or a process that's challenging, what we've done is write out like a playbook that just makes it a little easier to navigate that and give people sort of a more user-friendly way to approach it. So we did this for data sharing. There's a data sharing playbook that you can get access to through the OPM website. And it does this kind of thing in graphic form, where it just gives you a flow chart, like takes the steps and like lays it out in a more easy to understand process. And I think that's sort of part of what folks are asking about here, is just making sure that we're being transparent, both for ourselves as public sector and for outside stakeholders. So we've used playbooks in a couple of cases to take something that is maybe a little dense and make it a little easier to use, so that that encourages implementation and make sure that people are using this from the agency side. So we've got sort of the structured manual. So the playbook is something like that, which I think is has been a useful tool. This is not, again, a playbook for artificial intelligence, but I think you could imagine something similar for like the use of AI in state government. You just have it mapped out. What are the steps and what are the diagramming that? So I'm going to flag it here. That is everything. Adele, again, could not make it today. He would be more eloquent and effective at describing the IT policy, but you have our contact information should you wish to get in touch.
Scott, thank you very much.
Sure.
So I have a few questions based on that, and then I'll open it up to see if anyone else has any questions. One, so the advisory board, right, and that's what we kind of use the model for the data advisory board when we changed in this latest draft to create the AI advisory board. So you present the plan, the state data plan to them, right, and then they we'll hold a hearing on it and then send some suggestions back to you before you finalize the plan. Is that
Exactly.
the way that works? Okay. The other thing is, I know that Mark had mentioned, DAS really handles just executive agencies. But I know for the state data plan, there's the option for other agencies to opt in to using the state data plan. Can you just talk a little bit about how that has worked and have any of the other, I believe the way the statute is, it's other agencies and municipalities can opt into using the state data plan. Can you explain that, I guess, a little better?
Yeah, and some of this predates me when this was written, but it's written to allow for voluntary compliance with the plan. So it's the mandate is to executive branch agencies, again, defined somewhat narrowly, and we have a separate piece of legislation to correct how that's defined in the current statutes. But the it's executive branch agencies and others, which would include higher ed, constitutional offices, quasi-publics. Some of the watchdog agencies can choose to voluntarily comply with it. So usually what we've done for that is assess if there's interest or some priority, and then there's a letter from whoever's in leadership, and then they would go through the same policies and procedures that anyone else would. I will not say that there has been an upwelling of voluntary compliance, but there's there's an avenue for that, and it's just a question we sort of juggle when that's something you want someone to formally comply with voluntarily, or when it's just they're doing the same things, but you don't necessarily need a letter from the executive director for that.
Okay. And now, if they voluntarily comply, are they posting their data to the open data or their high value data, or?
Yes. Yeah. So there would be the intention is they comply with all sort of the steps of the process.
Okay. Great. Thank you. And let me see if there are any other questions. I don't see any hands raised. So thank you very much. Oh, actually, there is a hand raised. Okay. Professor Suresh.
Yeah, thank you for ask my question. One question I had for Scott is, you talked about the voluntary collaboration and how if an entity wants to voluntarily collaborate, they can share the data of the portal. Is there any sense in which there are sort of either completeness or other kinds of criteria for the data that you expect of the agencies who have to do this mandatorily that you do not have for the voluntary entities? Or is there some checks into how the data is, what coverage of data there is and so on? Is there any notion of that?
The way we've implemented it in Connecticut, and I don't know that this is how it's been universally, is that it's the same rules apply whether it's voluntary or mandatory compliance. And so when someone voluntarily complies, we say, we want you to do the same things, inventory the data, there's a planning process to figure out what's published to the portal. They go through all the same steps. There is, to answer the other part of the question, I think, what's implied here, there's a separate set of guidelines that we have for agencies when, for example, for open data, they were thinking about publishing data. There's a separate there's a guidance document that goes through what should you be publishing, what should you not be publishing, how would you think about that, who has the ability to actually publish that. So that documentation is sort of public and out there, but we would apply it the same way whether someone is complying, of their own volition or because they were told to.
Thank you.
And I don't see any other questions. So Scott, thank you very much for presenting. And so next we're going to go to Josiah Raish from Vermont.
Hey, can you all hear me all right?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for having me. It's great to be here. I think we're just maybe a couple hops down the road ahead of you all up here in Vermont. I'm the AI director for the state of Vermont. This is a brand new position created. I think I was brought on in like October. So we're not like very far down the road, but Mark had asked if I would be willing to talk about some of the work that we've done and where we're at and some of the lessons we've learned. So I think the framework that he laid out, and especially the approach, the risk-based approach, is a really good way to do it. And that was going to be my biggest lesson learned, was that you really want to focus on those higher risk systems. But what we did in Vermont was the legislature established an artificial intelligence council of 10 individuals. It's about half legal folks of various flavors, either representing the judiciary or like the ACLU, groups like that, stakeholders around the state, and about half practitioners in some form in the executive branch. So we've got folks from public safety, folks from our Department of Health, and of course, a couple of nerds from IT serving on that council. And the legislature laid out deliverables for each of the 4 years that the council was initially constituted for. So initially, we were focused on an ethics policy, on kind of scoping acceptable use for our first year, and we got those deliverables done. For the next upcoming year, we're looking at a system development and deployment and use protocol, and then rules around explainability and labeling, and then data management broadly. So that's our first couple of years, and then in the out years, it's a little more nebulous, but they're really looking to make sure that there's the ability for Vermonters to come back when a decision is made by AI that impacts them, to have an escalation point that's a human, and how we approach that, how we mitigate any harms that happen inadvertently or otherwise in our decision making. And as Mark pointed out, I think it's really helpful that we already have a lot of those structures in place to do that kind of oversight for human decision making. So really our goal is to augment those capabilities and and do a good job of monitoring all our decisions, whether they're made by AI or by human employees. One thing we found helpful was to ground our approach in Vermont's founding documents. So we went through our constitution and some of those documents as we were scoping our ethics policy, as we've kind of executed on what legislature asked for, kind of looking back at the frameworks that were already in place about the priorities of Vermont and things like that. That was helpful. We also found, and I'm going to throw this one on the screen for a minute because I haven't heard it mentioned yet. Let me see if I can do this. Share. This is from ATARC. They developed a framework for looking at AI policy broadly and the different categories you'd need to approach. And it sort of, as of early 2022, what the feds had done kind of for template policy in each of these areas. This was a really helpful framework for thinking about how we would approach AI governance and which areas we should be looking at, both as we were doing our own policies and then making recommendations to legislature for future statute. So I'll drop a link to this in chat, but this framework is quite comprehensive and we didn't have to invent it. So I'm all for stealing and or reuse of other people's work whenever we can.
Copying is the sincerest form of flattery.
Exactly. Couple other items that came up in the conversation, and I don't know how to make this bar go away, so I'm probably going to stop sharing so I can pull them up. We put together an inventory, and I'll drop a link to that in chat as well. And the inventory that we were asked to put together, it really took the approach that like anything that was an algorithm was kind of AI-ish, which is sort of true. However, that made a really broad inventory, right? Like that, if we took that kind of by the definition that was provided in statute, we'd be documenting everyone's Excel sheets. That, you know, because all those Excel sheets do support decision making, basically. That's what most of them are there for. So taking a bit narrower of an approach, as Mark has suggested, and it sounds like you guys are already on the track for this, really focusing on those high risk, locations or some level of acceptable risk, and then documenting and inventorying and monitoring everything above that. One other kind of big area of conversation, both in the public and in legislature, has been the, I guess, more philosophical side of AI. There's a lot of discussion about some sort of robot apocalypse, kind of on the extreme, but even less than that, thinking about what are the rights of AI systems. And we have taken the approach following Stanford and their human-centered AI working group, that really at this stage, what we're looking at is AI to serve as power tools, and taking the approach that we're really enabling human processes with AI. We're not seeking to develop whole new capabilities. We're not seeking to create completely different paradigms of doing business. We're really looking at the difference between building a house with a hammer and doing it with a nail gun, right? That's the approach we're trying to take to AI, and how we regulate it, and then also how we enable it, again, within the executive branch. So we're focused within the Agency of Digital Services on the executive branch, much like Mark is. We're providing our guidance and documentation and policies to be adopted by the other branches of government, but we don't have any kind of regulatory authority over the judiciary or the legislature. So those are basically being offered as templates and suggestions for those other bodies. I can keep chattering, but are there any questions at this point? And then I can talk a little bit about the current work that we're doing, if that's helpful.
Let me see if anyone else has questions. I don't see any. Oh, Professor Suresh, and then I'll ask some questions.
Thank you. Thank you for this. I had a question about the interaction between your ethics policy that you're developing and the development, deployment, use protocols that you're also going to be developing. Where does, for example, if you want to do algorithmic impact assessments, let's say you're trying to do impact assessments for equity or other concerns or safety or efficacy, where do those fit in? Is it something that the ethics policy recommends and then the protocol will incorporate, or is that the way I should think about this?
Yeah, that's the approach that we're taking. Is we've kind of used the ethics policy to shift our approach to a bit more risk-based. I've thrown up on the screen our appropriate and inappropriate uses at a high level, but we've included in here, how the system should be created and implemented, and then as we go down through, what are the characteristics of systems, which things are applicable to systems that have a direct impact on Vermonters, and which things are maybe only applicable to those systems and less applicable to things like AI and a firewall, right? Where the firewall is not really,
right.
The decision it makes is important, but not going to directly impact someone. So we've gone through these different areas and kind of tried to structure which considerations apply to which kinds of systems. And then as we operationalize this, we'll have best practices for how particular systems should implement these monitoring that we call for in the ethics policy.
Thank you.
And thank you, Professor Suresh. And actually, my question was along the same line, was that, are you doing it? So are you tasked with doing impact assessments, and are they required prior to implementing any, I guess, activity that it would be deemed risky, right? If you're using the risk-based framework.
Yeah, so legislature left that open for us. They didn't say you shall do it on all systems. They did say you will report whether it's been done for every system. So at this point, that's kind of up to the discretion of the AI Council and the Division of Artificial Intelligence, which I'm the director of. So we are going to be making those decisions about where the lines fall on when it's required and when it's recommended and when it doesn't need to happen, when we get to the operationalization a little bit later this year.
Thank you. Are there any, I guess right now, what learnings would you have to share with us as we're looking to, right, kind of follow along in
Yeah.
what you've done, right? We're trying to flatter the Vermont legislators who came up with this, but as you're working through it, are there things that have made your job harder, that mistakes we should avoid making? And
I think taking the risk-based approach will resolve most of the kind of scrambling I've had to do over the last year of like trying to figure out where it makes sense to apply to pull which levers. So, you know, stepping back from the commodity systems, like the Grammarly's and things like that, that are maybe a little bit less relevant to monitor. Drawing that distinction that I think Mark brought up between learning versus static systems. The way you monitor those systems and the amount of testing you can do upfront is very different in a system that kind of evolves over time versus a system that's like, we implemented it and now we're done. And then another item I'd suggest thinking about upfront is, as Scott mentioned, AI is really, really closely tied to the data that's used to train it. And so thinking about how we're going to, if we're providing our data for training systems or even fine-tuning systems, how are we going to approach things like bias in those systems? How are we going to ensure that we've audited the data up front, or just even saying you do need to audit the data up front prior to using it for fine-tuning to make sure there's no unexpected behaviors, either bias or just other kinds of weird unexpected behavior that pop out once the AI system is trained. One thing that was really valuable was we included our executive director of racial equity on the council. And she's actually become one of our co-chairs of the council, and having that perspective as an integral voice to how we approach AI has been really valuable. And I think just a different perspective than like the legal folks or the IT folks would tend to bring to the table. I think those are the big ones.
in your legislation, and I should have reviewed it before we had you present, so I'm sorry. But I believe there was both an advisory group and a task force that were created out of yours. And
So-
what was the purpose of the task force versus the advisory council?
Yeah, so the task force was initially constituted to figure out like what they were going to do. And that ran from, I think, 2018 through maybe 2021, and then
Okay.
presented their final report at that point. At that point, the task force was dissolved. Several of those members rolled into the council, and the council was stood up as a more permanent body to basically do advice and policy work to support the operational work that my team is doing.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You know, one other item I forgot to mention is figuring out what you want out of your executive branch employees focused on AI. So are you looking for some sort of center for enablement or center of excellence? If so, the types of people that Mark or others will need to find to staff that will tend to, you'll need people with a technical bent. If you're really looking more at a policy side, you'll want people with more of the legal bent. Or if you want both, then make sure that you've got a good support system in place for that team. In Vermont, they have sought to have both, and so that's why we have the structure of the council, which includes non-state employees, to provide some oversight in a sort of technical way, and then also the technical group that I lead.
Can you talk a little bit more about that, like a center for enablement? Because that is something, look, I want you to explain that because I want to make sure I'm understanding it.
Yeah, so with a center, people used to be all about centers of excellence, and now those are not as cool of a buzzword anymore as they used to be. But So the industry term is kind of shifting toward Center for Enablement, and the goal of that is subtly different in that you're trying to set up a group to encourage adoption and to put policy in place to help people go the right direction in a way that like isn't an impediment to any forward motion, right? It's not strictly governance as in saying no. It's focused on enabling people to do it in thoughtful and pragmatic ways. So what we're doing in our group, we're working and about to release a policy on the use of large language models like ChatGPT by employees, because it's a great tool, right? You can, like, we write a lot of papers and it does a really good job writing papers. So enabling employees to adopt that, but making clear to them at the same time that like you're responsible for whatever you have that system right. And ultimately you're going to sign your name to the bottom of that. And if you ever say it was the AI's fault, that's the wrong answer, right? Like you're never allowed to say the AI did that, not me. So that's what we're looking at enabling. We're also, there's two kind of big pilots that we're working on, one around RPA, robotic process automation, and the other around chatbot-based solutions, and trying to build template solutions in each of those areas that we can then repeat and extend and and use as accelerators for other parts of the government.
So, with the Center for Enablement, are you only assisting, I guess, your agencies, executive agencies, or is that something that could also, again, long-term I see, and I know with different structures between states, but having a Center for Enablement that would work with municipalities, right? Because I'm sure there are efficiencies and they wouldn't have the staff to implement this after we've developed the policy for the safe use, then to help them. And again, thinking out loud, which always gets me in trouble, so I apologize.
I think we would take the opt-in approach, right? In general, within the state, we're happy to provide technical assistance to, non-state governmental entities. But ultimately, we're not, the way Vermont works, like the municipalities are kind of very independent of the state in the way they operate. And we don't have any like county infrastructure, right? So kind of, yeah, okay. So there doesn't tend to be a lot of technical assistance. Our biggest area is probably our geospatial group. And that's probably the model we'll try to extend on the AI side.
Okay. Very similar here. So thank you for that. And I see Professor Suresh has his hand raised.
I apologize. I seem to have many questions, but this is a fascinating presentation. You mentioned the Center for Enablement and some of the projects you're working on right now. I'm really glad you're working on one for ChatGPT, and you also mentioned the other ones. Have you found the need yet, or are you planning to develop similar kind of policy? So, for example, you talked about data use and sort of making sure your data is sort of verifiable. And I'm sure you're aware of things like model cards and data sheets and tools like that people have suggested as for using. Are you planning to build policies around appropriate data use, disparity assessments, and things like that would be part of a broader responsible AI frameworks as well?
I expect so, but I see those as a little ways down the road because, well, with the two use cases I just mentioned, right, chatbots and RPA, they're kind of off the shelf, they're pre-trained, and you're really just ensuring that you're monitoring the outputs and that there's no bad behavior, and then you're fine-tuning if you see anything that's bad behavior, either in testing or in production. As we get into building more, I'll call them bespoke systems to support our business processes, yes, we'll be rolling out those kinds of policies then. And I guess when I say short and long term, I should point out, like, I've only been here for less than 6 months in this role. So so my long term is like a year and a half out, right? Like we're still getting headlights on these things.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Are there any, I don't see any other hands raised. Yeah, Josiah, thank you so much for taking the time. I don't know if you have anything more to share with us, and if you'd be willing to share I think you were going to put that one link in there, and if you could email any other information you think we would find valuable, that would be
Sure.
fantastic. And I think you had mentioned the appropriate uses. I don't know if those are public. If
Yep. So I just
Things-
dropped 3 links in chat. Hopefully those are helpful. 2 of them are to our legislature and reports that either the council or my group have issued, and those have a lot of these lessons learned kind of documented in them as future policy update recommendations. And then the ATARC policy is in the middle.
okay, good. Yes, that's great. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, Mark, I see you have your hand raised. Oh, clapping. I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm not fluent in emoji, so I'm showing my age, I guess. So thank you. Okay, next, Professor Suresh.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Maroney, and the chance to speak to your thesis working group. I have probably very brief comments. I was very much appreciate all the presentations that have gone before me, and I very much in agreement with what all the folks were saying there. I'd like to sort of reinforce the sense that, you know, focusing on critical decision making is very much important. It allows to sort of separate out the more, you know, common and more benign and frankly useful use cases that, you know, we don't have to be concerned about. And I think the text, the bill that I know you're working on critical decision making is very important. I had some, I don't know if you'd want me to sort of mention specific things that I think would be helpful in the bill as at a line level right now, or would this be a good time to do that, or should I hold it off?
Yeah, I
Okay.
think that would be great to give the
Okay.
feedback, and then if you could send red lines
Yeah.
or whatever suggestions.
Yeah, I think I'll send it. I think I may have sent that to you already. Let me repeat that right now, and I can sort of.
Okay.
So, for example, I know that in the critical sections, there's a very long and comprehensive list, which is great. I also was wondering whether, you know, insurance services, for example, health insurance, life insurance, and property insurance, and so on, would be something of consideration. Mostly because, for example, the Colorado Division of Insurance has been putting out draft regulations around the use of data, external data, in life insurance underwriting. I have actually an article that my team here at the center at Brown wrote about their process and what's good about their process, and I'm happy to share that link with your group. Might be worth considering whether insurance services, which are now beginning to use AI more and more in the underwriting process, might be worthy of consideration as a critical decision-making element. So that's one point. On the concept of, on the question of scoping, right? And I think, as people have correctly mentioned, it's important to make sure we scope what we're doing correctly so that we don't end up with either too much to look at or too little to look at. One suggestion is to be, you know, I think the current wording talks about machine learning and AI techniques. And one of the challenges here is that there are a lot of techniques that, depending on who you ask, will be considered machine learning or not, but are really the same thing. So one example of this is various kinds of regression tools, linear regression, and so on. If you ask a statistician, they'll say this is a statistical sort of task. If you ask a machine learning person, they'll say this is a machine learning task, depending on who's asking, right? If it means more oversight, they'll say it's not machine learning. If they say it means more investment in the company, they'll say it is machine learning. So there's a continuum, I think, of tools that are, because machine learning is born out of a lot of work in statistics. So it might be helpful to sort of incorporate that understanding in the wording. And I have some suggested wording, things like machine learning statistics or other data processing and artificial intelligence techniques, and also excluding various kinds of what we call passive computing infrastructure that doesn't really capture like Excel spreadsheets and things like that. So again, I have some suggested wording that I can share, but that might be something to consider as well. Finally, on a point I want to make about I really much liked Josiah's description of the AI Council and the different complementary skill sets on the council to make sure that all points of view are covered. I appreciate the point about the director of racial equity bringing that important perspective in. One interesting point to consider is that you mentioned sort of legal folks on the policy side and the IT folks. There is one of the things I think that is very tricky about this topic is that the challenges and the issues that come up and the solutions that we would like to propose sort of live in the middle space between what is traditionally the tech world and what is traditionally sort of the policy legal space. And so, as you know, when you put together this task force, I mentioned note there, having people who have some experience with AI governance or AI sort of policy and governance around it They might come from either of these places, from the legal place or from the technical side, but that have expertise specifically in this area would be helpful as well. So bring that governance sort of understanding, and there are a lot of folks now across the country have expertise in this that might be of use there. Another point, a last point I want to make is that I think the point about bias in, bias out, about data being the source of a lot of concerns on it is very valid. I think that's a large source of it. But there's also elements in the design process of systems. For example, how the designer chooses which variables to include, how the designer chooses what variables to predict, and how to interpret that prediction, and how the designers choose how to intervene based on those predictions, that I would broadly characterize as design choices in the design of the system that are influenced by the data, but are not solely about the data. And so the importance of algorithmic impact assessments is that it can tease apart and ask questions about how this design was done, because otherwise it is going to be very difficult to understand the level of risk associated with a particular tool once it's built in as kind of a black box. And I think to that end, in this trade-off between do we do the impact, is the impact assessment mandated for every system, or is it left to the discretion of the council? I think there are different models here that make sense. I think the challenge with, it seems like you almost need an initial, maybe a lightweight assessment to first figure out if there's any risk at all, rather than assuming that you leave all decisions on the impact assessments to the council in this case. So I think I don't think I have a clear answer, but I am leaning towards the idea that you want some kind of initial pre-screening, even if it's a light form, before it escalates to a full impact assessment, rather than having only the full impact assessment or nothing. And that's something to keep in mind. I'll stop there. I'm happy to take any questions.
So I have a few. So one of the things, and I think when we look back, in the revision, we tasked OPM with coming up with the policies and procedures for guiding, which is kind of when they have the data playbook. I guess that's data's policies and procedures. It would be an AI policies and procedures. We mentioned some things to consider when developing the policy, but I don't believe I specifically reference or require, and I need to go back, impact assessments or some kind of a light assessment. If we're taking a risk-based approach, I guess I'm trying to think of how we would do the language of if that's something we leave to them to purely come up with in the policies and procedures, or if I think it should be mentioned in there that is may include, or I think that we should include it, and they can decide, right? Either whether or not which areas would require pre-assessment. I guess that would be one way of doing it. Which functions or which processes might require an impact assessment before putting in implementing, right? And again, kind of looking at the product liability, I think you had mentioned in your previous presentation, right? A plane versus a car, there's different levels of risk and different pre-testing that's required.
So that's a very good point. I think, and Mark had mentioned this as well. For example, the NIST, National Institutes of Science and Technology AI Risk Assessment Framework, is very helpful here because it provides sort of very detailed guidance and questions you can walk through to say, okay, what is in fact the level of risk in this particular scenario? What questions should I be asking to understand where the risk comes from? So I think the RMF could provide very good guidance on what level of questioning is required and when it needs to escalate as well, if necessary.
Okay. And then the other thing, we had mentioned, going back to what Josiah, I think, had mentioned on screening the data before it's used for the learning, and then also learning versus static systems. If there are suggestions on language, right, how we can exclude it's a static system, I guess, as long as there's an upfront test, you don't need to do ongoing assessments, right? Versus if it's learning, and if you have any suggestions in that. So
it's not entirely clear to me that a static system does not require ongoing testing for the following reason. That let's say you've trained a machine learning system, you don't plan to have it evolve over time, but you've trained it once with the data you have. The problem is that the underlying data you're collecting is reflecting. Let's say you're building some tool to sort of make guidance around life insurance underwriting, since we were talking about that, right? And this is based on some data, and you built a model to do this. The problem is over time, things change, right? Maybe it won't change that often. Maybe it doesn't change in a year, but the underlying data, the population, the behaviors, the things they do change. And that model may no longer be relevant, even if it was static and done. In the same way that a model that learns from data itself might drift over time. So both the static and learning models do have the risk of becoming less and less accurate and relevant over time. It just may happen depending on the particular application at different time scales. And so I'm not convinced that a static one can be completely excluded from ongoing monitoring for that reason, but it's plausible that you have a different cadence of ongoing monitoring for such systems.
Okay. And then in regards to, I guess, the data that we use to train the systems, right, in pre-screening, do you have recommendations or?
I would definitely recommend, and I know that there are these technical tools, and again, some of the folks may be familiar with these. They're called data sheets, and they're basically almost like spec sheets for data that describe where the data has come from, in what context it was collected, what are known sort of skews and maybe under and over representations of the data based on where it was collected. I think having that information available to the assessor when they are assessing a particular trade system would be very helpful. So that's definitely one thing that comes to mind that people are beginning to use in industry as well now. That's the best we have right now.
Okay. Great. Now let me open it up and see if there are any further questions. I'll see if anyone has their hands raised. I don't see any other any hands raised to ask questions. Now, one concern that, and if anyone's listening can chime in on this, another concern I have is just, and we already kind of mentioned that state government processes are designed because of all the requirements and other things, they're slow, right? And they slow things down. Some ways, government is designed to stop bad ideas from happening, I guess, which unfortunately sometimes slows good ideas from happening. But when we go to the procurement process, I don't want to put another impediment if we're already slow. So if people have suggestions on how we can make sure we're protecting, if there are trade secrets, if companies may not want to bid because they're afraid that this is going to be part of an open inventory subject to FOI, what protections that we can put in to give companies assurances that they're not revealing their proprietary information, but that we're also still, providing protections for our residents and citizens. So I will look at, we did have trade secret language in the SB 6, so I don't know where we would need to put that in. The other, I guess, question that I'm thinking of, and again, we're going to have language, we're going to vote out of the committee, we're still going to work, so anyone here who wants to reach out and discuss or has suggestions for before Thursday versus, or wants to just set up a time to talk after Thursday. I don't know if we're going to task the advisory council with trying to come up with a Connecticut AI Bill of Rights based off of the White House's framework, or if we do need to do a task force as well as the advisory council. And I think the idea of centers of enablement, I guess, was how it was put. That is something I would be interested in looking at long-term, because obviously, first, we want to make sure we have policies and procedures in place for protecting residents, but there are definitely efficiencies that can be achieved by AI. And I think Connecticut is similar, that we don't have county level government. I don't think the municipalities on their own would be able to implement some of these in a safe way, in an efficient way. So I do see having a center that can work with the municipalities to help them. I think there are economies of scale there, right? It's a way we can help the municipalities save money and implement things ethically. So I would be interested in if anyone had any feedback on that or suggestions, or if that's something, again, that may be, I think, an idea we'd put to a task force. I don't think we're necessarily ready to do that, because I think we don't want to put the cart before the horse. I think the key is getting the guidelines in, and I think it is important having guidelines in before. I think, Mark had mentioned that we aren't using it in a lot of places yet necessarily. So perfect time to make sure that we're getting in the rules. Again, we sometimes do things the wrong way in government regulation, right? Where you let the cart get out of the horse and then try to regulate it, or get the horse get out of the barn, then you try to regulate it. So, okay, with that, I'll see if there are any questions. Let me go to participants. And so the other thing is, I'm not sure when, so SB3 is going to contain the pieces on the children's data and the healthcare data. There was a bill, I understand, that just passed out of the Washington State House on the reproductive healthcare data. So we'll be looking at that for definitions to make sure we're in alignment where it makes sense. And then that will be heard. And then what we'll do is, after that is heard, we'll go through and have a session on the reproductive healthcare data, and then on the children's data, and other sessions like this with people to present. So if there are no other questions, I just want to thank you all for participating, for your feedback. If you have any feedback that you want to send me that you think would be useful before Thursday, that would be actually, you need to send it to me before tomorrow, because we have to have the language drafted on Wednesday, or and Brian, the LCO, or legislative commissioner, who actually drafts the language, probably wants the feedback today, but we'll get it to him tomorrow for those changes. So thank you everyone for your time and assistance today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
Thank you.